My name's Brian Tees, and I grew up in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, in a suburb of Philadelphia. I grew up in an alcoholic household, and my early childhood, it was difficult. Early childhood was difficult. It was uncertain. It was unsafe. I'm an identical twin. I'm the youngest of 5 children in our family, and the household was relatively violent at times, and I wasn't really sure when things were going to break off into some type of a fight or an argument between my parents at the time. So I just kind of just went with whatever was going on in the household at the time. I loved playing Hot Wheels. I loved anything outside. My mother would give us spoons and tell us to go outside and just go dig little highways in the front yard underneath the pine tree. And we would play with our cars for hours and hours, and kind of that kind of stuff. Rode our bicycles, put baseball cards in our bicycle wheels, a flap. It was a thing we did when we grew up. But so my parents divorced when I was about, I'd say, 8 years old, and my mother remarried. And my stepfather, which would come into the picture, non-alcoholic, had a Quaker background, and never heard that guy curse. He was just so reverent, but he was really solid and kind and loving. And he worked for an aerospace corporation, and they brought one of their divisions from the aerospace corporation to merge with one from California. They brought it here to Utah. So that's what brought us to Utah 33 years ago. We lived in Holiday. So we moved right here to Holiday, Utah, and right below Mount Olympus. And that's kind of where things started off for us here in Utah. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm an identical twin. And we were everything to each other. Where there was one, there was the other. We'd never be apart. My mom would make fun of us when we were little kids. If you saw one, you saw the other. We wouldn't get out of bed unless we both came downstairs together or came out of our bedrooms together. We wore bracelets till we were about 12, so people could tell us apart. I thought my first name was Twin when I grew up. We're the twins. And we were very hyperactive, very curious, and he was the opposite of me in a lot of ways. I was somewhat of a Grateful Dead guy, like a little hippie guy. He was the flower child. He wore flowers and floppy leather hats and stuff through the 70s. And he moved out to Colorado, and he went out hiking one day. He went to work, and they said, but it was on a weekend, and some of the other crew didn't show up. He was an industrial painter. And what he did was he painted factories, I guess. And he said, well, we don't have enough people to run the crew today. So he said, great. Him and another guy went up into the backcountry, went to go explore the backcountry, and he ended up falling in a mine shaft. And he fell about a quarter of a mile into this mine shaft and lost his life. And where he fell is where he's at today. He fell too deep into the earth to be able to retrieve his body. So they just buried it over and put a turtle shell cement cap on it, and then we put a tombstone there and had a service for him, and that's where he is today. The impact that's had on my life is I didn't have any tools at all to deal with that loss, none. I was rocked. I mean, we grew up in the early years of our lives was very uncertain. It was unsafe. There was a lot of fighting in the family. It was very violent. We'd wake up in the middle of the night to stuff being smashed and thrown and yelling and screaming. We would hug each other, and we always had each other. And in all intents and purposes, I think that we survived that, And we survived a lot of things. I'm dyslexic. And we're both ADHD, and we would go to remedial classes, and he was a fighter. My twin brother, he was a fighter. He didn't like anybody messing with me. And Together, we grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia. It was a rough and tumble neighborhood. And he would protect me in a lot of ways, physically. Kids would bully me, and Wayne would step in and say, oh, no, 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 and he would start fighting and scrapping with them, and then I'd jump on their backs. So when he died, I felt a loneliness that is really difficult to really articulate. He was such a devastating loss. I mean, I was an egg with this guy, right? One sperm, one egg, two people, and my whole life was, hey, Wayne, what do you think? What do you want to do? What are we going to do? And then I realized at the age of 24, he wasn't going to be there any longer. And I was just absolutely devastated, like, I'm never going to be able to say, hey, Wayne. It's still painful.
Of course.
Yeah. So the impact of that on me was, I started to lean on alcohol more and more. It wasn't immediate. It didn't happen immediate, but Wayne was rough and tumble. He liked the biker scene. He liked the rough and tumble bars. And there was a bar that he would frequent, and I started to go down there because I missed him a lot. And I went down there, and they're like, hey, Wayne. I mean, we were totally identical. And I'm like, no, I'm his brother Brian. They're like, no, you're not. And I said, no, I am. I'd show them my driver's license, and they would see that. And they're like, oh, well, where's Wayne? And I told them that Wayne died. And I started hanging out with some of his friends and started drinking more with these people. And then eventually my addiction would start to take over to alcohol and then into other substances. And that would lead me down to a path of full-blown addiction.
How long was that period of time?
Before I went into, I'd say, a couple of years, a year and a half to 2 years. I knew I was kind of deep into the woods with my drinking and cocaine use, because if I did cocaine, I could stay up longer and drink more. But hanging out with some of those people and drinking kind of took away that pain and the feelings that I had. It just took away that pit that I had in my stomach, right? It didn't seem to matter anymore. And but eventually I would need more. And the more I would need, the less I was able to medicate that pit. And then my anger would start to show up. And then my sadness. And then just the idea that I was so upset that I'm alone. Like a loneliness, I'm back to this loneliness is going to be something that would have plagued me throughout this entire process of my addiction and into recovery. I was, I had a couple of scrapes with the law back in Pennsylvania. At the age of 18, I had a retail theft thing. I was with some kid and we were taking stuff out of a store and we got busted. But that was about the only scrape that I had with the law. And then when I came here to Utah, of course, I brought myself and my now newfound addiction with me. I moved here when I was just around 28 years of age, so 4 years after my twin brother died. And I got a DUI here in Murray. I left a bar in Murray and I got pulled over and I got arrested. And I went down to the Salt Lake County Jail, which at that time was pretty much underground. And it was a really horrid place. And when I got pulled over, I got pulled out of my car, I was fairly intoxicated, and the officer, they gave me the field sobriety test and asked me a bunch of questions, and I was being surly with him. So he, arrested me, shoved me against the car, went to handcuff me, and I became combative. And needless to say, they won. And I got taken to jail. And when I got taken to jail, I got put into a drunk tank with, just a whole assortment of people. I was scared to death. And they made me stay there throughout the night. Next day, I got I got OR'd and I left, and the car was impounded. Then I had to disclose to my family, like where I've been, what happened, the car. It was a long, tedious process. I had to go get my car out of impound. I had to find the money to do so. I didn't have the resources. I didn't have the income. It was a lot of money. Then I had to go see Judge Burton in Murray, and he was a pretty good judge. He wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't going to put up with a whole lot of baloney from me. And because I was going to go in there and try to smooth talk my way into, I wasn't really that drunk. I was just a little over the limit. That wasn't going to happen. So I ended up paying some fines, paying an attorney, and my parents decided that they would pay for an attorney, but I didn't get any help for my drinking, and it wasn't really addressed at that time. So it was a big deal, but it was a minor scrape compared to what was going to come. So, cycling into the system, if I could go back and talk to that young man that first got arrested and would have had the insight or the crystal ball of the future, I don't know if that would have really derailed me from my addiction, because I was medicating my sadness and my anger and my inability to manage my feelings and emotions. Alcohol gave me a sense of confidence and a sense of comfort, and took away some of the loss and some of the fears that I felt in life. Unfortunately, I would need more and more to sustain that. And the more I drank, the more I started getting into other things like cocaine and other substances, pain pills, cocaine, meth. And I would get into barroom fights. I would start getting into my temperament. I couldn't put a lid on my temperament. And I'd start getting into physical altercations. And for me, in these physical altercations, it was a release of all that bottled up anger and just resentment that I'm here and my brother's not. I would start getting arrested more often and more frequently. Then there would be some of the drug busts that would start to come, purchasing drugs and holding on to drugs and drinking and making poor decisions, driving drunk. I'd have a few more DUIs. I would have some possession charges that would start to accumulate. Then I would start building a record, and the more my records start to get built, the more time I would start to end up doing, because they were starting to see that, I'm becoming a career criminal in their mind. Jail's a place. It's scary, not as violent as prison. And the reason I want to bring that up is the prison system in and of itself is a very, very frightening, scary place. You've got people that are doing life in prison, and if they attack you or they get into an altercation with you or anything of those sorts, what are you going to do, give them another life sentence? They're already doing life. You don't have that element in jail. In jail, most people are trying to be somewhat on their best behavior as they can, because they're going to go see the judge. They haven't had a disposition to most of their cases. In prison, you've already had your disposition to your cases, and you're now waiting to see the board. In the state of Utah, it's undeterminate sentencing guidelines, so it's really up to the Board of Pardons on how much time you will do, like on a 0 to 5 years on a third-degree felony, a 1 to 15 years on a second degree, and so forth and so on. So it's very easy to turn a 0 to 5 charge into a 1 to 15 assault if you're in prison. There's 155 different active gangs in the Utah State Penitentiary. Those are DOC statistics, the Division of Corrections statistics. That's not, I've lived there, but those aren't my statistics. And prison was very rough and very scary, and I would tell myself I wasn't going to come back to prison, but I wasn't treating my depression, my anxiety. I wasn't treating my addiction, and I would always parole out and end up coming back. and it would become a revolving door for me. And then there was a part where I started to thrive in a place like that because I started to acclimate to the prison norms that are set by the inmates, if that makes any sense. And I would utilize my anger, my skills, and my fear in very unhealthy ways. And I would get very strong and healthy, and I would come out without having any skills to find a legitimate job. I'm dyslexic, as I had mentioned earlier, ADHD. I didn't read and write real well. So I would always live by my wits and by what I could do on the streets, not knowing this was going to be this revolving door for me. In the interim of that, I wouldn't be in any contact with my family at all. I would start to push them all away from me. And I'd go probably about 8 years without having any contact with anybody in my family. A lot of shame and guilt of what I'd become, the prison life, the barriers that this became for me to find a job. There were times I'd swear I'd lay in prison and I would be scared to death. But you can't show any fear in a place like that. It's like a drop of blood in the ocean of sharks. And it's a weakness. And you can cry in your pillow at night, and I don't know one person that's been through prison system and hasn't done that. No matter how hard they say they are, everyone's, especially around the holidays, or the death of a family member, because you're incarcerated and you're not able to go to those services or say goodbye to a parent or a family member. And life moves on, and for the inmate it doesn't. So I would swear to myself, when I get out of this, I'm going to be good. I'm going to do things differently. And eventually I would expirate my number. That meant they couldn't keep me any longer. I did the 5 years or 7 years or whatever it was that I was told I had to do. And I was able to get out and be free. I did that. And I got out. And I went right back to the same group of individuals I was hanging out with and running around with prior to going into prison, and expecting to get these different results, and it didn't happen. I would go back into alcohol, drug use, selling drugs, making drugs, methamphetamines, whatever I could do to support myself, and validating that would be okay. Eventually our house got raided by the police, or where I was staying, and I would go back to jail. And I'm in jail, and the jailer told me I had a visit, and I went over by the sliding doors, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm waiting for my visit," because in 8+ years I did time, the only person to come visit me were law enforcement agents to see if I would cop any cases or work a deal, and I just wasn't willing to do that because eventually I knew I'd end up back here and I have to live here, and for me it's a life-threatening ordeal, and I was going to take my lickings as they come, so to speak. So I'm standing by the door, and he says, "Well, you got a private visit." And I said, "A private visit?" He said, "Yeah, somebody's come to visit." I never had one of those. And I said, "Well, where's that at?" He said, "You got to go up those stairs." So I went to my cell, and I fixed my hair. I had long blonde hair, and I fixed my hair, and I tried to look somewhat presentable. I was pretty gaunt from being on the streets and using. I was probably about 145 pounds. Usually I run about 190, so I was very skinny and thin. And I went up to the visiting window, the visiting area, and there was nobody there but me. And I sat down on this stool and I waited for my visit. And I thought, well, I'll try to make myself look a little bit bigger than I am because my ego shows up, and put my arms like this. I want to look tough. And I fixed my hair. I was like Fabio. I had real long hair. And I flipped my hair to one side. And I was like, might be one of those girls from the streets that are going to come finally see me. And then I thought, no. So I settled on this, the stern look. And I heard a door open, and you can't really see who's coming because there's these little like things that stand out on the other side, on the visiting side, for privacy. And I waited what seemed like quite a while, and I saw somebody walk by, and then I saw a woman walk by, and they stopped, and they came back, and they came walking up and sat in front of me. It was my oldest brother and his wife. And I hadn't seen him for well over 8 years. And I looked at him, and I said, "How'd you find me?" And he said every once in a while, his wife, Pat, would get on the computer and check the pauper's grave, unidentified people that may have died in the streets, mental health hospital, jails, prisons, and institutions. Oh my, is what I thought. But they found me there, and I looked for, and for a split second I thought, that's a hard way to look for your little brother. But my heart's pretty hardened. I've got these big, thick walls that are very thick and very high. I'm not showing any emotion to anybody at this point in my life. And I leaned forward and I said, "Well, yeah, what do you want?" And in his flannel shirt, in his gray hair, he said, "Dad's real sick. He's got cancer. Mom cries a lot. And they need you." And I wanted to know if you're done. And he started to cry. He said, "I'm tired of going hunting and fishing by myself. I miss you and I love you." And it was at that time I whispered the words, "I think I am done." See, after all I've been through with the motorcycle gangs and the prison gangs, and I was a part of all of that. Make no mistake about it, in order to survive, you've got to be a part of something. It's just the way it is. And it's brutal, and it's just the life of survival at that point. And taking that survival stuff into the streets and trying to go get a normal job is, that in and of itself is a barrier. The mindset, the lack of education, the lack of resources, the inability to articulate oneself in a manner that's suitable for gainful employment that's actually going to sustain oneself and get your bills paid and pay rent. And it's not that I didn't want those things, I just wasn't able to. I didn't know. I didn't have any tools to do that. This whole thing started when I was about 24. So I didn't have a whole lot of experience at 24 and now into my 40s. So I told my brother, "I think I am." And I went and saw Judge Jimenez. And he wasn't the drug court judge yet, he was just a regular judge. And I told him this story I've pretty much just told you. My brother came to visit me. And he said, "I'll give you an opportunity. I'm only going to give you one. And given your history, your violent past, your gang affiliations, your biker affiliations," and he whipped out this big file and started waving it in the air in the courtroom. I'm standing there handcuffed and shackled looking at him thinking, holy cow, you never know how much stuff you've done till it's piled in one stack. And he waved it in the air. He said, "You have little to no chance at all of changing your life, Brian, at this stage of the game, at 42 years of age." And he said, "Are you sure you want this deal? If you go out on probation, anything, one mistake at all, I will send you back to prison. You'll see me for a few seconds, just enough to say, I'm revoking your probation, sending you to prison, and you will do 16 years. Or you can go today on, you'll probably do about 6.5 to 7 years and come out on parole. What do you want to do?" I said, "I'll take the first deal." He said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yep, I'm sure. Get me out. That's my whole thing, get me out." And so they released me. And that brother that came to visit me, I went to stay with him, and I would live with him for about 4 years. And that would take me to the next phase of my life and my recovery. No, I talked to Judge Harmonis. I said, I need help. And he said, I'm not going to order help for you, Brian. You've had ample opportunities over the expanse of your history to receive help and get help for yourself. So the ball is surely in your court. And I'm not going to order you to treatment. I'm not going to tell you to go to 12-step meetings. If you want to get the help that you feel you deserve, you'll need to do that on your own, outside of what AP&P will do for you. And I thought to myself, all right, we'll see about that, right? Because I still had that anger and that mistrust in the system in and of itself. Sure. And so I thought to myself, I'm just going to go out and just see how it goes. I got out, went to my brother's. I mean, I have no way of living in society as such without a drink or a drug or some type of manipulation or lie at this point in order to get what I want or get what I need. And basically it was get what I need at this point. And the reason I bring that up is because I needed to have that drug or that alcohol or that substance, and I had to fuel that and I had to find a way to do that. And there'd be a lot of lies and hustles to do that. But at my brother's house, they don't live like that. And there's no way I was going to be able to lie, manipulate to my brother or my sister-in-law. I mean, I guess I could, but there was a part of me that really wanted change. And this was a very pinnacle point for me because I had no tools. I had no way of, I didn't have any life skills. How about that? So I was scared to death. First and foremost, they wanted to put an ankle monitor on me, and I had to have my brother's house phone set up so they could monitor where I go, and I didn't like the idea of a dog leash. An electronic dog leash is what I named it. And I thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll go into treatment. Because then if I'm in treatment, I'm in care for residential treatment, I won't have to have the dog leash. And it was kind of a manipulation. It was a manipulation on my part because I didn't like to be controlled by the system, so I was going to make my own rules, which I would become accustomed to doing. So I signed up for Salvation Army. I signed up for First Step House and Odyssey House. And I went to an AA meeting because I wanted to be sober. As a condition to be at my brother's house was I had to go to meetings and be sober. So I go to this fellowship hall meeting. It's a noon meeting, and the guy asked me to share. And I've been out of jail for about a week. And I started sharing that I put my name on this list to go to those places. And after the meeting, he was the chair. His name's Ray Y, and he pulled me aside and he said, I have some connections at Salvation Army if you really want to go into treatment. And I said, I do. I need to treat myself. I need to do something different. There was some truth to that. There was a part of me that knew I had to do something different. So the manipulation was also some truth in it. So I went to Salvation Army. I had a little plastic bag with just some letters I had got from jail. I didn't have any clothes except for the clothes on my back and whatever little hand-me-downs my brother gave me. And I showed up to Salvation Army. And I went in there and I sat down and I talked to the manager at the time. And he said, well, this is going to be X amount of money per month. And something interesting started to happen. My face got red and I felt my eyes tearing up. And I don't remember the last time I cried in front of somebody. And as my eyes teared up, I saw my hope going away. And I grabbed my little bag and I stood up and I said, I don't have any money to pay you. I don't have any insurance. I don't have anything except the clothes on my back and these letters and this paperwork I got from the jail. That's what I have. Thanks for your time. And I started to head for the door. And his name was Riley. And he said, just a minute. It's almost dinner time. You look hungry. "Are you hungry?" And I said, "Not particularly. I'm not taking any handouts." And prideful, ego, false pride. I was starving. And I said, "No." He said, "Well, listen, the men are about to have some dinner. Why don't you go into the dining area and get something to eat? And let me chat with you when you get back." I said, "Okay." So I went out there and had some dinner and talked to some of the guys. And towards the end of dinner, he came with me with the commanding officer of Salvation Army, and they pulled me into an office, and they said I could stay. I stayed there for 6 months. Changed my life. The first 30 days, 45 days was rough. They had a weight room downstairs in the basement. I would get up every morning around 5 a.m., long before the 7 a.m. call for breakfast. And I'd go down there and I'd start lifting weights. And I would get big and I would get strong. And I would have very 18-inch arms and chest, and I'd work out and I would eat a lot of food. And I would store some food in my room and I'd get busted for it. And they would write me up for it and would take away my visiting, put me on restriction. There's rules. And it didn't bother me because nobody's coming to visit me and I'm not going to go visit anybody else. So, I was kind of like living, I was like in prison, working out, getting strong. And one day, about a month and a half into it, Troy, he was the guy that ran the facility. He's a good guy. He's a pastor, and devoted his whole life to Salvation Army and God and serving others. He pulled me to his office. He said, "Brian, why don't you have a seat?" And I thought, "Oh, I'm in trouble now." I said, "What's up?" He said, "Well, have a seat. I said, "Tell me what's going on first." He said, "I just want to chat with you. Can you have a seat?" And I said, "Sure." Still not trusting, still very guarded. Those thick walls are still there. And he said, "Some of the men are worried about you, Brian. You don't talk to anybody, you don't socialize, you're up lifting weights every morning, you're getting bigger and stronger, and you hoard food, and you do what you're expected, but they're just worried about you." He said, "Can I ask what's going on?" I said, "Yeah, I'm just waiting for the time where you tell me it's time to leave." And he said, "We're not going to tell you that here, Brian." I said, "Eventually you will, everyone does." And he said, "No, we're not going to do that." We had a staff meeting this morning. This was in the afternoon, my discussion with him. And he said, "We decided to pull you from the thrift store, because we would work in the thrift store, we would work for Salvation Army during the day, and then at night we would have our programming for substance use disorders and AA meetings, and so programming was at night." And he said, "We decided we're going to send you down to the homeless shelter to work with the homeless." And I said, "I'm not doing that." He said, "Excuse me?" I said, "I'm not doing that." He said, "Well, Brian, I want you to know the other day your probation officer showed up. Apparently you went to your brother's and your brother said you were here." So he came and showed up, and he called this morning and he let us know that he talked to Judge Himonas, is it? And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Judge Himonas made it a condition that you need to finish this treatment if you're here as a part of your probation, completion of your probation." And I smiled and said, "I'd love to go help the homeless." Sure, because I'm a manipulator and a liar, and that's what I said I'd go do. Where would I get started? I would love to go down there and help them. So away I went, and I was there about, I guess it was like my third day or fourth day down at Vincent de Paul for the evening, serving the meals. And there was about well over 1,100 people, 1,100 standing in line that stretched all the way around the building, down the sidewalk, and halfway around the block. Incredible that, I'm thinking, where are all these people coming from? And it was about 12 degrees out and it was in February. And I saw a young lady holding a child in her arms, and the child had grocery sacks wrapped around the child's feet. And she had two other little children that were old enough to stand on their own next to her. And they didn't have much clothing. And I walked over and I said, hey, I think I got some clothes and some shoes that might fit you and your kids. And I went over to the Salvation. She said, yeah, okay. And I went over to the Salvation Army. He had a truck parked there, and there was a barrel of shoes, and I knocked it over, and I got what I thought would fit. And I grabbed some pullovers and a couple of coats. And I ran over and I gave them to her. Without a word, no thank you, nothing. She just put her kid down and started dressing her children. And the line kept moving. And then I heard something that really struck me. I heard a good half a block away, somebody said, Mrs. Jones. Hey, Miss Jones. They screamed all the way down. It's your turn. These people are equally freezing. They're equally hungry. 200 people go in at a time, sit down, eat, get up, leave, another 200 come in. They saved that woman's spot in line. They weren't going to let another person cross through the threshold until she got there with her children, because it was her spot in line. On the way back to Salvation Army that night, I found myself crying on the van. It softened my heart just a little bit. Took some bricks out of that wall. The humanity of that, the decency of that. They looked after each other. To this day, I'm still affiliated with the Salvation Army. To this day, I still work with the homeless populations of Salt Lake City. And to this day, I still advocate for the underserved populations in our society. I would go on to become and not many people know this, so I'll tell you, a pastor for Salvation Army, chaplain. I spent many, many years in my recovery, and I would continue to work and live with the Salvation Army and end up becoming a chaplain. Ironically enough, I'm a chaplain for corrections.
That's amazing.
Oh man, I mean, I would have to say the number one barrier first is housing, adequate housing. And it's going to go hand in hand with employment. If I can't find a job sustainable, and what I mean by that is a living wage that can sustain my place to live. Once I got a job, I couldn't find a place to live. So I'd lose the job. I mean, you have to have a place to live, a place to shower, a place to bathe, a place to be able to sleep, wake up, and go to work. When you're living in the streets, very, very difficult to do that. The shelters is a whole nother thing in and of itself. And I've tried that, the shelter. And that's a whole nother different piece. I mean, most people figure we can go to the shelter, go get help there. But you know, there's tuberculosis, there's head lice, there's bugs, there's people that are untreated mental health issues, there's people that have untreated addiction issues. It's ground zero for a guy like me that's trying to stay off of drugs and alcohol, right? There's fights, there's, it can be very violent in and of itself. And then have to get up, go to work, and try to, maintain that, and then come back, get in line at 7 p.m., and then you wait in line to see if there's a bed, and then you go back in, and that's how that works. So the barriers in and of itself, like for employment and for housing, are the two top barriers. Being able to just be able to take care of yourself and sustain yourself. Employment's really hard because once they find out you have a record, you're done. So there was some times where I would fill out an application and it would say, have you ever been incarcerated? Have you ever been arrested? Have you ever, I mean, my record's extensive. And I don't say that lightly. It's just a part of the disease process for me. I'm making a lot of poor decisions under the influence of drugs and alcohol. And I wouldn't say anything, and now I'm living on eggshells. When's the time going to come? They're going to really look at my record. It's going to come back, and they're going to fire me. That's happened quite a few times, actually. And I could go do some construction jobs, but that's seasonal. And quite frankly, I was getting a little too old to do construction jobs because of my body was giving out. So I think employment and housing are the top of the food chain for some of the barriers. The stigmas that are associated to somebody that has a history or have any type of criminality in their background is it's an uphill climb for anyone, even if you are doing well. Okay, let's talk about Judge Jimenez. So I often thought about Judge Jimenez when I was at the Salvation Army, and when I came out of the Salvation Army, I was still on probation from his court. And eventually I would come off of probation. And 2 years prior to seeing him off of probation, I was watching the news and I started to realize that everyone talks about people that have come out of the system that have reoffended. Right? And it dawned on me that I don't know if anybody has ever gone back, and told the judge, thank you. So I got dressed in my suit that I got secondhand from the DI, and I put this little suit on, and I go and I tell the court clerk I want to see Judge Jimenez. And she says, what's your case number? I said, I don't have one. And she's very perplexed, and she looks at me, what do you mean? So I'm going to see the judge. But you just can't just come see the judge. You have to have a court case. And I said, well, I'd like to talk with him. My name's Brian Tees. I gave her a little bit of a scenario of what my history's been like with Judge Jimenez, and I'd like to give him an accountability of what I've done with my time. Oh, I don't think I've ever had anybody do that. Well, okay. Well, you're welcome to sit around, and he has court this afternoon, and so I sat around. In the afternoon, I went to go see Judge Jimenez. I sat in the courtroom, and he finally called my name because she put it on the docket. And I went up to Judge Jimenez in my suit, and I said, hi, my name's Brian. I don't know if you remember me. He said, I remember you, Mr. Tees. And I said, I just came here to give you an accountability of what I've been doing with my time since you saw fit not to send me to prison. And I pretty much told him what I just told you. I went to the Salvation Army. After that, I've continued to work with underserved populations. I started going to college at the Salt Lake Community College at this time, and I'm creating a food pantry at the college to help serve that underpopulation of people that have food insecurities at the college. I'm studying to get an associate degree with the intention of going to school and becoming a social worker, and getting a couple degrees to be able to be more of service to my community. And he looked over at his court clerks and the prosecutors and everyone in the courtroom, and he started to get tears in his eyes. And he said, I've been on the bench for over 20 plus years. I've never had anybody come in here and give me an accountability of what you just gave to me. And he said, you've made my day, Mr. Tees. And so I thought, well, when I graduated, I went back to see Judge Jimenez, and we would start to get a relationship through the court that I wanted him to know the decisions that he makes are also positive as well. And I felt it very important to do that. I also hunted down all of the arresting officers over all of my court records, and I went and found them and thanked them for saving my life. He stuck out in my mind because he gave me an opportunity to change my life. The prosecutor wanted to send me back to prison. My court-appointed attorney from the LDA's office said, "You're going back to prison. There's no way around it. The house got raided. There's copious amounts of drugs here. You've got multitude of more felonies. You're going to prison. You have a prison record. There's nothing I can do for you." Plain and simple. They didn't want to hear I needed help. They said, "That's not going to happen." But when I saw Judge Homonis and I told him that my brother came to visit me, and I told him that I am asking for the first time, I need help.
It's a big thing.
It's pretty emotional
Yeah, of course.
because he heard me.
Yeah.
When you're in the system, you don't get heard very often, and you start to not become seen, and you're pretty much moved in and out of the system without really having a face or a real name. And I thought to myself, the least I could do is own up to my bargain with him. And I have, and I still do. Well, I'm in recovery at this point. I'm in a 12-step program, and I'm going to meetings. I have a sponsor, and my sponsor was a Vietnam veteran, a very highly decorated Vietnam veteran. I had no idea. He never spoke about it. I wouldn't find that out until he would pass, and I would do a eulogy at his funeral of the extent of his service record. I knew eventually he had, been a veteran. I'd take him up to the hospital when he became ill as he started to get older. And early on, he said, "I heard that you, some of the veterans," because he ran a little group for veterans, talking about this guy named Brian down in the streets, helping veterans out, walking along the river bottoms and giving them resources and clothes and food. And sometimes this guy Brian even just shows up in the middle of the night with a blanket. "I suspect that's you." I said, "It is." And he said, "You ever thought about going to school for that?" And I said, "No. No, guys like me don't go to school. Guys like me don't go to college." His name was R.C. Collard. And he wouldn't mind me using his name. And R.C. was a tall, skinny cowboy, bronc rider, real deal. And he looked at me with those steely little blue eyes and his cowboy hat, just right underneath the brim. And he said, "Why don't you go try?" And I said, "You don't understand, I'm dyslexic. I got cognitive learning disabilities. I'm just too stupid to get an education, R.C." He said, "I didn't ask what you thought of yourself. I asked you, how come you don't go try?" So, with his promptings, he took me over to the college. I took an acuplacer test. He sat outside in his truck the entire time. 4 hours, putting out cigarette butts out the window. He had a whole pile of them out there, non-filtered Camels. I opened up the truck door. He said, "How'd you do?" I said, "I think I did okay." "They don't give you the results right away." He said, "Well, let's go get some supper and go to the meeting." A week and a half later, I got an envelope in the mail that said, "You've been accepted to college, you can go." And that's what started me on college. So I would go on, I would complete the 2-year associate degree. I would go on to the University of Utah College of Social Work. I would go into their bachelor's program. I would do the bachelor's program and a substance use disorder counseling certificate at the same time. So I was doing about 18, 19 credit hours a semester. It became a full-time job for me. I had to really, really put everything I had into that. I realized that if you and I talk about something, if I read it, we talk about it, I'm a 4.0 student. And I graduated with a 4.0. I went through the master's and, I went through the bachelor's program, and then I went into the master's, and I did the master's in the advanced standing program in a year. I graduated with multiple degrees, and I started working for a treatment center here in Utah, a place called Cirque Lodge. And I've been with them for the past 8 years.
It's incredible.
And then the college that I was so afraid of and so worried about called me and asked me if I would mind coming back and teaching. So I teach there, or I hadn't taught the past couple semesters due to COVID, and I don't want to teach online. I like to do things in person. So, but that's my deal. So when I went to sign up for the bachelor's program at the University of Utah, I had to disclose I had a history. It's on the application process. Do you have a criminal history? And I had to disclose yes. And then I had to go talk to, the person running the program, bachelor's program at that time. And I told them Doppel's willing to give me a license if I can pass the college. And they said, this could become a barrier for you. And I said, I don't think a guy like me is going to get an expungement. But I started to get more engaged in our local government and within our local community and recovery in a different way than I had before. And I started going to rallies through a place called USARA. And there's a woman named Mary Jo and her husband, Sean McMillan. Sean is pretty much a mentor of mine, and I love him a lot. He also encouraged me to go to college. So now that I'm at this level of education, I went to Sean, and Sean said, we've been working on these expungements, and we've been trying to change legislation. So the recovery community stood up and said, we're going to change legislation. I became aware of some of the legislation that was being pushed through, and I started to follow this legislation. I started to advocate for this legislation. And then when this legislation went through, I went to the Board of Pardons, and I grabbed first you got to go to the BCI, Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and I had to fill out paperwork there, and I had to get a denial letter. They gave me the denial letter, and then they said I need to go to the Board of Pardons, because now there's an override. The Board of Pardons can override the BCI. You have 5 incidences or more, you're going to get denied. I had multitudes. So I went over there and they gave me a stack full of papers, and I started to hand fill them all out myself. And I couldn't do school and do that at the same time. I filled everything out. I took it down to the courthouse and I submitted it to 3rd District Court. And about a week later they called me and they said, you need to come pick up all your stuff. There's a shelf life, for lack of a better term. The expungement papers that I had, the certificates that I had a 90-day shelf life, for lack of a better term. And they said they ran out, the judges aren't going to look at your stuff. I was very disheartened by that, and I didn't know what to do. And there was a gal named Angela Admore, and she was an attorney, and she had a little advertisement at the end of the Board of Pardons, and told me to, so I went over and spoke with her, and she said she'd help me pro bono. And she put everything together, and we went before the Board of Pardons, and they heard my case. They elected to hear my case. And then I was at work at CERC and getting ready to finish my bachelor's. Actually, I was starting my master's program, and I was in my master's program, as a matter of fact. And they called me. I went outside and stepped out of our meeting and went outside in the parking lot and called them back. And they told me that I not only got a full expungement, but also got a full pardon. And I cried and I said, what does that mean for me? And they said, what that means for you is you'll never have to check the box again. I said, are you sure? She said, I am absolutely sure. I did go on a test at the college when they called me and asked me if I'd come teach for them. I had to fill out an application, and on the application it asks, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Have you ever served any time? Have you ever had a criminal history? And they're all 3 significant little boxes. And I thought to myself, I don't know what to put here. And they said that I don't have to check the box. So I checked no, no, and no. And 2 weeks later, they called me up and said, come on in, sign the papers, and your history came back fine, and you're good to go. It opened up a whole new door for me. And I might want to add, I tirelessly am an advocate for people such as myself. I would tell them, let's take the things off your record that we can. I would tell them that due to the Clean Slate Act they now have in Utah, which is, I mean, I'll start crying all over again if I start talking about that. But Class B misdemeanors, Class A misdemeanors, things that are drug and alcohol related can fall off your record after a period of time. To wait those period of times out, see what falls off, and continue and always continue to advocate for yourself. And more importantly, take ownership of the fact that you have a history. We all do, right? We're not bad people. I was a sick person learning to get well. That doesn't negate the idea that I broke the law. It doesn't negate the idea I made a lot of poor choices. And I take complete ownership of all of them. However, it was that lifestyle and those choices and those things that led me to be the therapist I am today and the man I am today and the recovery that I have today with 15 plus years. So I would tell them to just keep moving forward, and if they need anything, and I do a lot, and if they need anything, my phone rings quite often and I will help them. I look for friendly employment opportunities, and when I call friendly employment opportunities is employers that are willing to hire people with a record. I mean, I go and talk to CEOs in my spare time. I'll go knock on someone's door and say, well, what do you think about hiring this person? They're a perfect fit, they have a history. They're clean, they're sober, and I'm going to vouch for them. I think campaigns like this are important for a multitude of different reasons. Everyone has value, regardless of what they've done. I believe everyone should have the opportunity to change. I know I'm much different today at 60 than I was when I was 50 or 40 or 30 or even in my 20s. I've changed over the years. I don't think that people should have to have these tombstones of their past they've got to drag with them wherever they go for the rest of their lives. If they've really made the adequate changes in their lives, why wouldn't we want to help? Why wouldn't we want to come alongside of somebody, stand beside them, honor them? If they're respecting themselves, shouldn't we respect them as well? I think if you really look at the big scheme of things, we're all just walking each other home, aren't we? When it comes time to meet my maker or our maker, if there is one, and I believe there's something. In fact, I know there is somewhere in my hearts of hearts. I want to be able to say, I helped, regardless. It's easy to love people when they're our family, our friends. Much harder to love people we don't understand. Much harder to reach out to somebody, take them by the hand in the cold of night or in the sunlight of the day and say, I'll stand beside you. I'm not going to do it for you, but I will stand beside you and help you do this. If we measure our society as an enlightened society, and it's measured by the way we treat our most vulnerable populations, which are people with mental health, disabilities, substance use disorders, coming out of incarceration, whatever that is, and we call ourselves an enlightened society, then I believe we need to check our enlightenment. Yeah, you know, I want to thank you for your tireless efforts to help people like me. You are seen and you are heard and you are well respected. Norms of our society don't typically lend its hand to, why did Bobby throw the rock through the window? You questioned that. You took it a step further and a step deeper into, what does Bobby need? It's not so much as he broke the window, which, by the way, is stimulating the economy, but that's a whole topic for another day. But he not only broke the window, but what's going on with Bobby. Let's help Bobby get some value. And what you're doing is you're doing restorative justice. The Salvation Army took me in when nobody else would. My dream and my goal is to one day have a house where people can come, specifically where they can get glasses.
Love that.
I had a man come out of incarceration after 25 years, and he was so frustrated. He didn't know how to operate his phone, no idea. Computers, everything. 25 years.
Changes a lot.
And he lost. Put in Bonneville halfway house, comes out of Bonneville, gets a little apartment. It reminded me of Shankshaw Redemption with Brooks.
Mm-hmm. Amazing movie.
He just says, I just want to go back, Brian. I don't understand it out here. See, in prison, I'm somebody. Out here, I'm nobody. In prison, I'm well respected. In prison, I know what to expect and where to go and what to do. And I said, well, would you please give it a chance? Would you trust me enough to give it a chance? So we got a little job at Hush Detergent. I called somebody over there and said, look, I want you to give this guy a job. And he said, well, who the hell are you? I said, well, I'm Brian Tees. I'll tell you what, I'll come over and see you. Hung up. I went over. And I knew somebody that worked there. They got me in touch with the HR department. I went in there. And there was some manager sitting in the room and overheard the conversation. The lady's like, well, I don't know. And he came out and he said, hi, I'm so-and-so. So what do you want to do? I said, I just got this man. He spent a lot of years in prison for something he did when he was very young. Can you just give him a job? He's really good sweeping floors as a janitor. Well, they gave him a job. They paid for him to get a license to drive a forklift. He's making $23 an hour.
Amazing.
He's got insurance. He's got vacation. He found his children, and they were much older, but he found his children and started building a relationship with them. And that's a price tag you can't.
No, give somebody's life.
Yeah. And it worked out really well for him. And it still does.
I love it.
Yeah. And that's why I figured you do what you do, because it's the same stuff.